So I just got home from about a 20-day excursion to Egypt, and one of the things that I was most impressed by the Giza Plateau in particular, aside from the fact that it literally dwarfs every single other ancient site that I have ever been to, is actually the density of architecture and tombs and tunnels and shafts and holes that lead to seemingly nowhere that are scattered all around the Giza pyramids. It seemed like everywhere I walked on the peripheral of the Great Pyramids, there was some strange hole or shaft just falling off into the ground 40 feet down or more, where I couldn't even see the bottom. The entire plateau around the Great Pyramids is filled with these mysterious, strange, alluring, dark shafts, tunnels, and crypts that lead to nowhere. I was blown away by the sides of Menkaura's mortuary temple and the length of the causeway, and I was even more bewildered that Menkaura's valley temple still remains beneath the sands. And as I stood on that causeway, peering out into the southern desert away from the Giza Plateau, I could only think about how many other ancient treasures must be buried beneath these sands, beneath the foundation of Giza's fourth dynasty, and I wondered, how much further back does all of this construction go beyond the fourth dynasty, into the third, second, first, or even pre-dynastic Egypt? Now, a lot of time is spent by a lot of people studying these great mysteries of the Giza Plateau, like how the Great Pyramids were built and what their entire purpose was. But one thing that I always like to consider is, who were the people that were actually living here on the peripherals of this great construction during its time, some 4,500 years ago. And at so many ancient sites throughout Egypt, you can see the evidence of these earlier seeds at these temples, leading back further into antiquity. You can take Karnak Temple, for example. We found this base of a column that had been exposed of this gigantic temple that once existed but was built on top of by later dynasties. Now, the primary builders at Karnak Temple are pharaohs of the New Kingdom, such as Hatchepsut or Thutmose III. But evidence suggests that it actually goes all the way back to the end of the Old Kingdom around 2100 BC under the pharaoh Wahonk-Intep II. These little details that are very easy to miss are what makes studying Egyptology so satisfying for me. And it really brings the nuance and the detail and the mystery of Egypt to life. And throughout the several days that I spent at Giza, I was always pointing off into the peripherals, just imagining what must be laying beneath the waves and millennia of sand that is built up around the Giza Plateau. What secrets does Giza still hold, and how old must some of these still buried structures be, and how much older than the Great Pyramids must some of these still buried structures be? So I started researching. What existed at Giza before the Great Pyramids? What existed there before the Fourth Dynasty began their major construction projects? And is there any evidence of this? Or was Khufu the very first builder at Giza and there's nothing there before him? Well, the Great Pyramids exist upon the Giza Plateau, which sits above where the Egyptians would have lived in this rich, fertile, black land that is seasonally inundated by the Nile. We often think of Egyptians as being these loincloth-wearing desert dwellers riding camels from place to place, but that couldn't be further from the truth. These were people who were filthy rich, living in an absolutely beautiful tropical area. They were spoiled rotten by the Nile. They were not desert people. They lived on the Nile. And the vast majority of them were barley and wheat farmers, and giving up portions of their agriculture as well as seasonal labor is how an Egyptian paid their tax to the pharaoh. Now, we do have evidence that people were living along the Nile for as long as 70,000 years, but why is it not easy to be able to find these First Dynasty, Second Dynasty, Third Dynasty homes that were down the plateau from the Giza pyramids? Well, there's very little real estate in Egypt. Egyptians have never lived in the middle of the desert. They only live in the tropical areas right along the Nile, and that's very slim pickings for real estate. And that real estate has been built over dozens and dozens of times over the last 5,000 years. So it's impossible, almost impossible, to find these homes from early dynastic or pre-dynastic Egyptians. However, we do have monuments that are still almost perfectly preserved that mark their existence. And this is why tombs are so important in Egypt. Egyptians didn't build their tombs where they lived, they built them and dug them in the deserts and in the cliffs west of the Nile, where they have remained pretty much untouched for the last 5,000 or more years. As a little side note, if you're ever traveling through Egypt on one of my tours, you will eventually notice that all of the tombs in Egypt are on the west side of the Nile. Well, why is that? Well, the Egyptians, like many other cultures around the world, revered the sun. They were a sun-worshipping culture, and they called it Ra, R-A. It was born in the morning and it died in the evening, and it gave life to everything vital in the Egyptian world. And sometimes you see this word Ra in the names of the pharaohs, like Khafra, who is the pharaoh that is attributed to the construction of the middle Great Pyramid, or the second pyramid. Now, a Ka to an ancient Egyptian is the spiritual double, the vital essence of that body. So you have Ka and then you have Ra, which is the vital essence of Ra, or the likeness of Ra. Then you have the pharaoh that is a descendant of Khafra, which would be Menkara. So you have Min, which means everlasting or enduring, and then you have Ka, which means the essence of, and then you have Ra, so the everlasting essence of Ra. And Ra would be born in the east and would die in the west. So Egyptians buried themselves in the west to be reborn again in the east. It was a deep, deep part of the Egyptian psychology. And this is actually where the classic phrase comes from when people have passed away and you say they've gone west. This comes from ancient Egypt. So these western tombs are in their greatest density from Abu Sir all the way down past Saqqara to Dashur, where Senefru's red and bent pyramid are constructed. Now, these numerous tombs would have belonged to people who lived in and around Memphis, which was Egypt's long-standing ancient capital. But sometime around the Great Unification of Egypt, which would be around 3100 BC under the first pharaoh Narmer, all the way until Egypt would fall after the death of Cleopatra and the annexation into the Roman Empire around 30 BC. And really even a little bit after that, as many Greeks and Romans would bury themselves out here too. But what about north of Abu Sir, up at the Giza Plateau? Is there anything there that actually predates Khufu, or the Great Pyramid? Well, it's not easy to peer through 5,000 years of continuous construction to find the earliest structures that are sitting at the very bottom. But we do have a few glimpses of earlier construction. So in 1904, archaeologists uncovered what they believe to be the oldest mastaba at Giza. Now, a mastaba is what is believed to be the precursor to the step pyramid. If you look at the step pyramid, it's comprised of 5 or 6 different mastabas, and it's essentially a large bench-like structure where there is either a tomb inside or a tomb carved into these tunnels and crypts underneath the ground, and it's this large rock building that is built on top of it to prevent tomb robbers from being able to get inside the crypts underneath it. So they call this a mastaba. Now, after discovering a clay seal with the symbol of the pharaoh Jet, they dated this mastaba to the first dynasty. And this is about 4 centuries before Khufu. Now, later on, Flinders Petrie would return to this mastaba and document it in more detail. And it was constructed out of mud brick and was consistent with the style of architecture found in various other first dynasty mastabas. This was a huge structure, approximately about 120 feet by 50 feet, and it's not actually known who was entombed inside this mastaba, but clearly it must have been a very important person. Maybe a pharaoh or someone directly related to the pharaoh, as in the first dynasties, the entire cabinet or the government that served the pharaoh was made up of the pharaoh's family members. And it wasn't until later on, sometime on the later half of the 4th dynasty into the 5th and 6th dynasties, where various people from outside the pharaoh's family began to take prominent roles in the Egyptian government. And really, unfortunately, this is actually the beginning of the end of Egypt's old kingdom, because you have other powerful people who are not directly related to the pharaoh rising in prominence, wealth, and power in Egypt and began to challenge the pharaoh's power. And the very beginning of that is actually the beginning of the end for the old kingdom. It's very, very important that in Egypt, the pharaoh and his family, but really the pharaoh, has absolute power over the entire land. But nonetheless, unquestionably, this mastaba marks the burial place of a very important person who lived during Egypt's first dynasty, which is again several centuries before Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura. And dotting the exterior of this huge first dynasty mastaba was somewhere around 55 to 60 other smaller tombs, which had been heavily looted, but Petrie was able to find and document several artifacts that made it seem that these were artisans, painters, dancers, people who would have been close in relation to whoever the owner of the central mastaba was. Interestingly, when Petrie penetrated the structure, he measured the inner burial chamber and found that it measured 35 feet by 18 feet. Now, for anybody who's an expert on the Great Pyramid, you will know that those are the exact dimensions of the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber. And that is obviously very unlikely to be a coincidence. Certainly, there is a significance to this measurement and these proportions that is lost to us some 5,000 years later. And I'd love to return to this mastaba and explore it and document it for myself to present to you guys, but unfortunately it was recorded over 100 years ago, and somehow the sands of time have reclaimed this burial site and nobody knows the location of it. Additionally, Petrie is recorded to have also discovered a mastaba from the second dynasty. He said that he found it, quote, on top of a ridge facing the cultivation in front of the mastaba from the first dynasty. He was able to find an entrance into the mastaba where he recorded a series of 2 portcullises, which are essentially where you lower down this large granite door jamb that is supposed to permanently close off outsiders from the inner chamber. But he was able to get past these 2 portcullises, which had probably been raided far back in antiquity, thousands of years ago, and he made it into the inner burial chamber. Inside the chamber, he found numerous soft and hard stone vessels, as well as 5 clay seals bearing the name of the pharaoh Ninetjer, which he used this evidence to date the mastaba to the second dynasty. Unfortunately, this mastaba has also disappeared to the sands of time. You have to think, if these large and important sites are being covered up by the Giza sands in just a century, you have to imagine what else is out there that has been covered up by 5,000 years of constant blowing winds. How far down on the Giza plateau must some of these early dynastic or pre-dynastic burials and structures be? Fortunately, we do actually have a third mastaba that was documented by Petrie that he dated to the third dynasty, but it was actually found by an archaeologist named Covington. This mastaba is known as Covington's tomb, and it was excavated in the area known as Mastaba Mount, where a collection of other burial sites can be found as well. Mastaba Mount sits about 5,000 feet directly south of the Great Pyramid, exactly in that area south of the Giza Plateau where I was looking off into the desert and just imagining what else must be out there. The earliest reports of the mastaba come from Covington and Petrie, which describe the exterior walls or the casing stones as leaning in on themselves and being packed very tightly without mortar. This is not dissimilar from the other early pyramidal mastabas that have been found at Saqqara and other First Dynasty sites. This innovation of these stones being tightly fitted towards each other and leaning in on themselves is really an amazing architectural innovation in such remote history. You can only imagine, how did architects ever think to make walls that aren't straight up but are instead leaning in on themselves? It was probably to create stability as well as making it even more difficult for tomb robbers to be able to break into the structure. If all the stones lean on themselves, the structure has even more pressure in on itself, making the blocks harder to quarry away. And its interior led to a tunnel network beneath the mastaba that was this large series of crypts and shafts, and may have even inspired the tunnels beneath the Saqqara pyramid as well. Using the artifacts inside and around Covington's tombs, both Covington and Petrie dated the site to the third dynasty. And interestingly, they also documented that they felt that Covington's tomb was perhaps aligned directly southward from the Great Pyramid. But unfortunately and oddly, their fleshed out documentation of this was written in the early 1900s, but wasn't released for over a century later. But it might be because they realized that this northern-southern alignment with the Great Pyramid was actually incorrect, as just about 40 feet to the east of Covington's tomb lies this very strange mastaba platform structure. And it's actually this strange platform that is in perfect north-south alignment with the Great Pyramid. It was excavated as though it were a mastaba, but no interior was ever discovered. All that Petrie ever found in the early 1900s were fragments of various early dynasty artifacts laying around it. He climbed up to the top of the platform where there was no entrance, but there was this singular pit in the middle of the platform. Now, what could this pit be? Well, it may be, just maybe, it is a pit where a large wooden beam was slid down inside, and as it faces directly true north-south of the Great Pyramid, it may have been used by the Great Pyramid's architects to perfectly align the pyramid to true north and south. It would be very interesting if any other platforms with pits in the middle of this could be discovered, perhaps west of the Great Pyramid, as if there were any to the north or to the east, they would be covered up by modern-day Cairo. Now again, both this platform and Covington's tomb exist in this larger area known as Mastaba Mount, which was probably the central part of a larger network of a necropolis that was quarried away or has just been covered up by the sands of time over the last 5,000 years. But Covington's tomb and the viewing platform are not the only sites in the southern desert that actually predate the 4th dynasty. There is an entire ridge along the peripheral of the southeast corner of the Giza Plateau known as the Mahdi Outcrop, and this is a place where numerous tombs that are attributed to the construction workers of the entire Giza Plateau have been found. And on top of that, there is a small amount of evidence from an ancient dump site that shows us that this workers' village or town was actually not too far away from these tombs. The evidence seems to point towards the fact that during the construction of Menkaura's Valley Temple, which, okay, so you have a pyramid construction. You have the pyramid, you have the mortuary temple, and then you have the long causeway that leads down to the Nile River. And the temple that connects to the causeway to the Nile River is known as the Valley Temple. It exists at the bottom of the Nile Valley. It appears that the construction of Menkaura's Valley Temple actually displaced a local workers' village. And during the construction of Menkaura's Valley Temple, part of a section of or the entire workers' village was actually collected and dumped nearby in the desert. And this is what archaeologists found just around a century ago. Among this heap were a plethora of artifacts with pharaonic seals dating anywhere from the early 1st dynasty all the way down to the 4th dynasty, including the pharaohs Khufu and Khafra, but nothing of Menkaura, meaning that this settlement probably did not exist during Menkaura's reign because it was destroyed during Menkaura's reign. On another side note, as impressive and as important as Khafra's Valley Temple is, I found it really striking that when I was standing on Menkaura's causeway, looking down at where his Valley Temple should be, it was, to this day, it is still completely covered up by the sands and is not currently excavated. I find that very surprising with how important Menkaura's site is and how important Valley Temples are. And lastly, although it's a very popular idea among alternate history purveyors such as Graham Hancock or Robert Schoch or various others, it is also proposed by bona fide Egyptologists that the Sphinx may well predate Khafra's reign or the entire 4th dynasty as a whole. Or at the very least, the limestone outcropping which later made up the body and head of the Sphinx was a venerated monument that was facing due east by earlier dynasties such as the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st, or even pre-dynastic Egyptians. And only later was this limestone outcropping reformed into the body and face of the pharaoh Khafra. Or perhaps it was originally a limestone outcropping that was then shaped into a lion, that was then shaped into an Egyptian sphinx as we see today. Now, of course, when you're dealing with artifacts and monuments that are around 5,000 years old or even older, the evidence is very scant to begin with. And really the only evidence that we actually have for the Sphinx being much older than the 4th dynasty is the very obvious and deep water erosion marks that line the Sphinx pit, which these erosional marks seem to indicate that the Sphinx must have been dug out during a time when Egypt was experiencing much, much more rainfall. Throughout the course of the early dynasties into the end of the Old Kingdom, Egypt was rapidly drying up. And it's actually thought that drastic climate change and drought may have attributed to the fall of the Old Kingdom around 2100 BC. which seems to make it pretty unlikely to me that the Sphinx would be able to incur that much erosion if it were constructed towards the end of the earlier dynasties around 2400 BC. If I had to take my academic hat off for a moment and just speculate, I don't really find it implausible that the greater limestone outcropping that perhaps made up or would later make up the Sphinx body and head may have been dug out and venerated during early dynastic or pre-dynastic times, let's say somewhere around 3100 BC, maybe a little before or afterwards. And during this time when Egypt was much more wet than it would be 1,000 years later, it was able to incur this kind of rainfall that give us these erosional markings. Now, when exactly that limestone outcropping was actually cut and formed into the body and head of a lion or the body and head of a sphinx with the head of a pharaoh, we will never exactly know. It's pretty obvious that the head of the Sphinx today is representing the head of the pharaoh Khafra, but what it was carved into before that is pure speculation. However, on the other hand, I don't really find it implausible that during the construction of Khafra's pyramid, as they are paving that causeway, they run into a large limestone outcropping, and rather than coring it away or paving straight through it, Khafra and his architects, probably his architects, see it as an opportunity to turn this huge limestone outcropping into a monument dedicated to Khafra, and they turn the causeway to the side, build a valley temple next to the Sphinx, and then build a temple in front of the Sphinx. That doesn't seem implausible, but then you have to consider, well, that's at 2400 BC, and Egypt is rapidly drying up towards the end of the Old Kingdom. How do we account for the amount of rainfall needed for those deep erosional markings at a time when Egypt is about to be completely dried up? I guess that's one of those great mysteries of Egypt. If you'd like to see some of the sites that we talked about today, including the Sphinx and all three of the Great Pyramids, as well as every other significant pyramid in Egypt and every other significant temple and burial site in Egypt, then I really hope you'll join my tour here in just a couple months when I'm returning to Egypt. It'll be from January 13th to the 26th. We'll be exploring the land of the pharaohs from Alexandria along the Nile all the way down to Aswan and back to Cairo. It's going to be an expedition that you're not going to want to miss. I just returned from a trip to Egypt, and it was one of the best times of my life, and I'm really excited to return. If you would like more videos covering in-depth aspects of ancient Egypt, well, please like and subscribe for more, as that's really all you have to do to help out the channel. I'm Luke Caverns, and we'll see you next time.